get reaction now. I am joined by social justice activist Busi Seabe. Busi, good to have you on the program this afternoon. So with the recent budget cuts announced by Minister Sive Kwarube, how do you foresee these changes impacting the quality of education in the country?
Thank you very much for having me, and good afternoon and early evening to the listeners. I think it's important for us to be able to understand that if you want to contribute to the destruction of the future of any country, you destroy the education sector, amongst others, to make everyone dependent on government handouts, thus creating a hyper welfare state. And this is essentially what we're seeing happening right before our eyes. And I think it's imperative for us to understand that we already know and are experiencing that the state of education is extremely unequal, and poor learners across the country are suffering and remain underfunded in our education system and will continue to suffer if no tangible solutions are presented. What we already know is that looking at, the numbers that the minister has given us in the sense that there are shortfalls between, 79 billion to 118 billion in the next 3 years or up to the 27-28 financial year, it is imperative that we note that this would mean that there will continue to be serious shortages in the education system, with the possibility of even more crowded schools, fewer services, less money spent on important school infrastructure, and ultimately a poorer learning environment. We've already seen that, there has been significant cuts made to feeding schemes, for an example, within schools, and this has had dire consequences for learners that were dependent on those feeding schemes. We are seeing also, reductions within the scholar transport, system within basic education, and that also has dire consequences for learners who aren't able to get to school without those supporting services. So we are seeing that there's a serious crisis within our education system, and it continues to disadvantage the poorest of the poor. And this is something that the minister needs to take into cognizance in her 10 by 10 strategy meeting that she's going into with the Treasury this week.
But can you elaborate on the specific areas that you're aware of within the education sector that will be most affected by these budget cuts, and what long-term consequences might arise in this situation?
I think we need to be able to look at the fact that, the minister needs to look at more creative solutions, such as changing the fiscal framework of austerity and find ways to use education to boost economic growth, along with, other government spending, which will then increase, tax revenue and ultimately spending on education. And some of the areas that will suffer the most, apart from, teachers themselves and parents, are the learners. So in terms of school materials, those will suffer to a large extent. When we look at infrastructure, basic infrastructure for schooling, that will suffer as well. When we look at, sporting facilities and capabilities within schooling environments, those will suffer as well. So we're looking at a multifaceted kind of crisis that will affect all levels of the education system, particularly impacting the poorest of the poor in marginalized communities and underserved environments in rural areas. And this is something that I believe the minister needs to take into cognizance. We can't just sit by and watch our government as they plan to build a palace, for an example, for the Zulu king in Palito. We can't sit by while we watch them buy new cars, while we watch them increase their salaries, yet they are cutting down on education and failing to protect the frontline services within that sector. I generally do support the minister's request for a meeting with Treasury to highlight the immediate pressures that the education system is facing and to request financial solutions in the upcoming medium-term budget policy statement. But I think it's imperative that by approaching Treasury with a 10 by 10 strategy, which is constructive, because it has all 9 provincial treasuries, it has the 9 provincial departments, it's got the Department of Education and Treasury itself. I do believe that the only stakeholder that is missing is the trade unions, and trade unions such as the National Professional Teachings Organization of South Africa, such as SADTU, who will be able to communicate the grievances and proposals that educators have, such as cancelling the BOT, such as cancelling, and removing GEC and the DBE activity book to cut costs and spending in education. And, when looking at discussions such as the 10 by 10 strategy meeting that we're about to have in the upcoming week around implementing, stronger oversight mechanisms, this is something that must be attended to within that meeting, because, the minister does complain a lot about corruption, and that corruption is part of the reason why there is a financial deficit within the education sector. And we need to be able to look at implementing stronger oversight mechanisms to reduce the corruption and ensure funds are used effectively. But more than anything else, the minister must stress how better, or must stress essentially how we can essentially use funding better, and there can be accountability from that perspective, because schools can provide high quality education, they can benefit students and communities, and moreover, the department must conduct stakeholders engagements ahead of their meetings with Treasury, as in, by involving educators and parents in budget discussions in order to foster a collaborative environment to ensure that decisions reflect the needs of those that are directly impacted. So to answer your question in short, I would say that all sectors within the education department and within the tangible schooling environment will be affected by these budget cuts. But more than anything else, it will be the educators and the learners themselves that will be mostly impacted.
But as we wrap up our conversation, Busi, what do you believe are the underlying reasons for these persistent budget pressures which are facing the education sector?
I do believe that this has been a long-going and long-standing issue. I don't believe that these issues are only arising now with the new minister. It would be unfair for us to just point the finger at her. I do believe that, Angie, the former minister, Angie Motshekga, was sitting on this crisis and not attending to it with the same, vigor and zeal that the current minister is. And we must, to some degree, acknowledge the fact that she is open, and there is accountability from that perspective, in that she's open around the crisis that she's facing. But we must also be cognizant of the fact that the minister has yet to give us a comprehensive long-term strategy for education funding that will secure the future of education in the country and lead to a more skilled workforce and stronger economy. At some point, this GNU government needs to prioritize education, and this is what we're seeing coming out of this crisis. We are seeing that evidently the previous administration, the 6th administration, and now the 7th administration under the GNU government needs to prioritize education, as it helps to bridge the gap for undeserved communities, thus possibly helping to, promote social equity and enhance social well-being, which is something that isn't really talked about as much in this country. And more than anything else, I think we also need to be cognizant of the fact that, in this GNU government, we do have a DA minister, and understanding that the DA refuses to acknowledge the role of colonial and apartheid education systems, which entrenched inequalities for centuries and decades, will further divide and maintain hostility between, trade unions such as SADTU, teachers, learners, and this DA-led department. So more than anything else, if we were to even advise the minister, we must advise her that she must consider converting, for an example, contracts, converting contract posts to permanent posts, or to, instead of letting people stay on sick leave for 2 to 4 years, she could medically retire them, for an example, and also bring down the retirement age. And when we look at what is happening currently, for an example, in the Western Cape, and additionally, if we also look at the Western Cape, Gauteng,
very quickly, if you may, Busi.
Yes, if we essentially look at KZN and Gauteng and the Western Cape as having a deficit in their budget because of the increased numbers due to migration, the minister must start looking at reducing admin staff and automate admin, and the department needs to, for instance, reduce a lot of the indirect funding that it gives out to other sectors focused on education.